I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to come down from this podium because I feel like I'm too high elevated up here in the air. I also want to say I'm honored to be here specifically for the Derry lecture. Interdisciplinarity is at the heart of what I do as a constitutional lawyer, and a cynic would say that's because constitutional law isn't actually a discipline. So since we don't have our own discipline, we have to borrow from everybody else's disciplines, and that makes us interdisciplinary. I actually think that's true, but I hope that it's true in a positive way. And as you'll see from my comments today, I want to address the question of the trajectory of the Arab Spring from a range of perspectives. And those will include the perspectives of political science, of religion, of constitutional analysis, and ultimately, I think, of political sociology. So that's the game plan. And in order to do that, what I'd like to do with your permission is divide my comments really into two parts. The first part of my comments will be an attempt to explain what's happened in the trajectory of the Arab Spring with special attention to Egypt, touching briefly on Tunisia and Syria as examples of what could go right. In the case of Tunisia, I don't want to overstate the case. Things are not perfect in Tunisia, but they're better there than in any other place. Let's say they're closer to the script that some of us hoped for. And Syria is the example of the extreme case of what can go terribly wrong, with my main focus being on a country which has gone by turns somewhat right and now probably more than somewhat wrong, which is Egypt. So my first part of my comments will be to try to explain what's happened. What I will say might be controversial, but I hope it won't be too controversial when I try to account for what's happened. The second part of my comments, which I think might be much more controversial, but is also more tentative, is an attempt to explain why things have developed the way that they have in Egypt. And there, because we're in the middle of things, we're in medias res literally. Events are still continuing in Egypt and will continue to. In that section, my comments will necessarily involve hypotheses, and I will give you some alternative hypotheses and tell you what I do and don't like about each of them. And then I hope in our time for a conversation, and we should have, I hope, 20 or 25 minutes for a conversation, perhaps even a little bit more, I hope we can talk about it and try to figure out, to the extent that we can, what might be the right way to think about why things have developed as they have. So with your permission, I'll just dive right into it. The Arab Spring began with spontaneous protests in Tunisia that were most famously touched off by the self-immolation, the burning of himself, of a frustrated fruit seller. And in the weeks and months that followed, more and more people in in Tunisia, where these started, not in Algeria for reasons that I will return to, in Egypt, and then in a range of other Arabic-speaking countries, went to the streets protesting and calling for fundamental change. In the standard narrative of what happened, we are told that the people who went out into the streets brought down the governments. That's the standard picture of what is supposed to have happened. And it's a good story. It sounds good. It also sounds like it somehow matches the events in Eastern Europe when people went into the streets to bring down the former Soviet Union and the other Soviet satellites. As it turns out, not only is that not what happened in the former Soviet Union, it's definitively not what happened in any of the Arabic-speaking countries on which I'm going to focus today. Instead, I want to suggest that what happened in each of the countries where there was fundamental government change was the following. A public, motivated and frustrated with the way things were, weakened the existing governments by going into the streets in large numbers, proclaiming the illegitimacy of the government and demanding change. Then, in a subsequent step, and I can't emphasize this enough because it's fundamental to everything I'm going to say later on, in a subsequent step, the army in each of these countries informed the head of state that he, and it was always he, was finished and was going to have to go. And then, in the coup d'etat that followed the public weakening, we moved on to a new state of government. Now, let me just give you a concrete example so you don't think I'm making this up completely, because it may sound a little bit different from what the newspapers and the television were saying at the time. Take Egypt. In Egypt, more than 1 million people gathered in Tahrir Square, Independence Square, which, for those of you who have been there, is right in the center of Cairo, right by the museum, right by a lot of the central institutions of the country. Big empty space, huge space, really. 1 million people could easily fit there. And they returned day in and day out, and they bravely risked their lives, and they weakened the government to the point where, what did the former president Hosni Mubarak say? Did he announce that he was ready to go? No. He said, I'm going nowhere. He insisted that he was still the president and remained a president. And he continued to do that until 9 p.m. one evening when he went on television to say that he was still the president. And the next morning at dawn, the chief of staff of the armed forces, the head of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, sometimes called the SCAF for short, which was a general named Tantawi, appeared on television and said that Mubarak was no longer the president. And only then was Mubarak taken out of office. So the night before, he had insisted that he was still in charge. The next morning, the moment when he was no longer in charge was a moment brought about by the army. He was being told, in essence, that the army would no longer acquiesce in his rule, it would no longer support him, and it expected the change to happen, and that ended his time as president. Something extremely similar happened in Tunisia. The reason it didn't happen in Algeria is that in Algeria, the structure of the state was already wholly set up in military control. And as one political scientist said to me at the time, a Moroccan political scientist said to me, this is kind of a funny joke, he said, well, the reason there's no coup d'etat in Algeria is that the army can't have a coup d'etat against itself, which I thought was very funny. Of course, it's not technically true. The army can have a coup d'etat against itself. It usually happens when young officers overthrow the old officers. In this case, none of the young officers initially had the power to make significant or fundamental changes within their militaries. And the reason is that the military regimes in the region were sophisticated enough to know that 50 years ago, they all had young officers making coups, and those young officers learned that the thing you should be afraid of is the young officers. And they spent most of their careers keeping a careful eye on those guys. Now, there were many situational factors that led to the militaries in the countries where fundamental change happened deciding to get rid of the government. But there is one consistent theme that I want to point out, which we'll come back to later. And that theme is what I will call the problem of transitions. Dictatorships have a major problem with transitions. Any form of government needs to have some mechanism for changing authority from one person in charge or one group of people in charge to another. That's fundamental to every system of government that's ever existed. In democracies, you do it via elections when it works. For many generations, skeptics of democracy said that it would never work because it wasn't good at transitions. Because what if you hold elections and you elect someone and the person who's in charge says, I'm not going? And it was a serious problem, and it has been a serious problem for democracy in many places in the world. Our kind of easy acceptance in a country like Canada of the natural nature of transitions is the product of a shared political culture of practice where we simply assume that after elections, one side will go and the other side will come in. Now, the political scientists have a theory about why this happens. And political scientists are, I'd like to say some of my best friends are political scientists. They are very cynical people. They're wonderfully cynical people, cynical in the best possible way. And they think that nobody would voluntarily give up power if he thought he could get away with not giving up power, unless there was something in it for him. And so they don't think that political culture is a sufficient explanation for why people step away from office when they lose elections. They think there needs to be some incentive layered into the culture. What's the incentive? The incentive is knowing that when you're out of office, your property will be respected, you will not be purged, you will not be sent to prison, and most important of all, you'll have a chance to run for office the next time, and then you might get into office. So to political scientists, democracy is just a funny old way of changing political power between different parties. You could do it, they believe, by rolling dice. instead of elections. This is the most cynical of political scientists. And it might work just as well. It might not produce the same public sense of legitimacy, but it would in practice work as well, because the idea is that the political elite who are in power and the political elite who are out of power are all just winking like crazy at each other and saying, let's trade places. You protect my rights when I'm out of power, I'll protect your rights when you're out of power. And in this virtuous circle, cynical but virtuous, the system can then sustain itself as a democracy. I want you to keep that political scientific model in the back of your mind. I'm not asking you to accept it. Just keep it in your minds as a model when we come to the really hard question of why. If you don't have elections and you don't have a monarchy, monarchies parenthetically are very good at transitions because they have a very clear rule, typically, for transitions, then how are you going to make a smooth transition? Major problem in a dictatorship. Almost every dictator wishes he were a king. Somehow dictators are almost always men. Not always, but generally. You can ponder why that should be the case too. Almost all dictators want their children to succeed them. And once in a while they succeed. Hafez al-Assad, who was the dictator of Syria for a long generation, was successful in transitioning power to his son. So successful that his preferred son, his older son, who was trained to take the job, but was killed in a suspicious plane crash, never got the job, and it went and said to the younger son, who was a dentist, sorry, an ophthalmologist, forgive me, an ophthalmologist. Was he an ophthalmologist or a dentist? I'm now forgetting. Ophthalmologist. I'm confusing with another famous dictator's son who's a dentist, but that'll be my trivia question. So a man who had no expectation, of becoming president, and probably didn't want to become president, frankly. But you know, your father says you have to go home and do the job, and so you go home and you take over the family business. In this case, it was a country. But with that exception, other dictators in the region have had a very hard time transitioning. Doesn't mean they didn't want to. So in Egypt, you had an old dictator whose son was not a very credible candidate to run the country. Gamal Mubarak, the son of Hosni Mubarak, didn't have a military background. He was a skilled politician in his own very narrow space, dealing with largely rich entrepreneurial types. He tried to build a base of legitimacy among them. And as a result, he alienated the military, which was never going to like him much in the first place. It was probably a calculated gamble to alienate the military. They weren't going to support him anyway because he wasn't a true military man. An old dictator without a credible line of succession is a liability if you are the military and you like to run the country. Because there will be a fight when the time comes for transition. When you combine the fact that the public is up in arms, that more than 1 million people are willing to risk their lives in the streets to get rid of this person, with the fact that time is going to get rid of him soon enough anyway, you see that the logical thing to do is get rid of him. And so that is what the Egyptian military did. A very similar thing happened in Tunisia. Old dictator, no clear transition. Military got rid of him. Now, what happened after the militaries had gotten rid of these dictators? Well, in the contemporary world, the transnational ideal of democracy has become extremely powerful, especially over the last 25 years, and especially since the collapse of communism. It's not so much that anyone thinks democracy is so great, it's that there isn't really another credible alternative yet. Now, in 25 years, that may look very different. China is in the process of a long-term effort, which I won't speak about now, although I've been writing about it recently, to create a credible alternative that solves the problems that democracy sets out to solve without democracy, without elections, and without freedom of speech. Whether they'll succeed or fail is a fascinating question. We could talk about it if we feel like it. But right now, it's not a globally credible alternative. So in the wake of the collapse of the Mubarak government, the call was for elections, and everybody expected there to be elections. If there hadn't been elections, it would have been extremely difficult for the military to justify simply continuing with itself in power. Now, in Egypt, they flirted with this. The military flirted with the idea of either installing its own figurehead president or just continuing with a direct military dictatorship. They considered the possibility. But they didn't do it, and I want to suggest to you that the reason they didn't do it is that there was one organized political force within Egypt that was as significant as the military, and indeed, other than the military, was the only organized political force in Egypt that did not want to see a military dictatorship, and that organization was the Muslim Brotherhood. Now notice I haven't mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood or Islamist politics thus far in my comments. And the reason is that the Brotherhood and Islamist politicians were not an important factor in bringing down the regimes in any of the Arab Spring countries where change happened. They weren't significant in any case. We could argue about Yemen. This is my claim about Yemen as well. But I'm not going to talk about Yemen because very quickly this lecture would become unmanageable. And I'm trying to follow the thread right through. And you would become very irritated with me. So, the Brotherhood was not visibly or in large numbers in Tahrir Square and Independence Square trying to bring down the government. They weren't. Similarly, in Tunisia, the Brotherhood-affiliated party, they're kind of cousins of the Brotherhood, which is called the Movement and Party of Nahda, which literally means rising up or renaissance, and functions as the Islamist political party in Tunisia, was also not in the streets in any significant way. Now, it's actually an intriguing puzzle as to why they weren't. But I will simply say in brief that the best explanation, in my view, of why they weren't in the streets is that they were unsure whether the regimes would ultimately be allowed to topple by the armies. They didn't know if it would go down or not. If they did go down, they were poised to run for election. If they went into the streets and then the uprising were forcibly suppressed, they might be finished as a political force forever. And if you think that that concern was foolish, naive, or unrealistic, then you haven't been reading the newspapers for the last 3 months. They made, in my view, a realistic assessment that to go too soon into the streets was just stupid. Stay and wait and see how things play out. Of course, once it became relatively clear the regimes were going to go down, you had to get out there, because otherwise you would lose all credibility. And that's pretty much exactly what they did. Now, in both the case of the Brotherhood and in the case of Nahda, you're talking about movements that over the last 25 years have become self-consciously in their programs Islamic democratic. Now, what I mean when I say Islamic democratic is that these are movements that formally and overtly assert two different things. One, they subscribe to the slogan, Islam is the answer. Islam huwa al-hal. Islam is the answer or the solution. Solution is a better translation. Islam is the solution. So they argue, again, this is a rather vague formulation, but they argue that political solutions must be infused by Islamic ideals and values. That's what makes them Islamist. Simultaneously, they're democratic. Why? Because for the last roughly 20 years, they have been arguing in their published programs and in their public statements that the system of government known as constitutional democracy is compatible with Islamic ideals and values, and sometimes it's even argued that it's necessary in the contemporary world from the standpoint of Islamic ideals and values. So these parties are Islamic democratic in that their formal platform called for the equality of men and women before the law. It called for the equality of all citizens before the law. It called for the rule of law. And it called for democratically elected officials to make governmental decisions, while simultaneously calling for two things. One, for the government that's elected to be informed by Islamic values when it passes laws. And two, for a principle that no law enacted by the state may violate the principles or values of Islam that are the most, fundamental core values. Okay? So that's what was meant by Islamic democratic. That's what these parties were. Had they governed anything? No. They had never governed anything larger than their own internal party membership. They had zero practical governance experience. What they were good at was organizing. And in both Tunisia and Egypt, they organized highly effectively, and their platforms were highly appealing to the public. And in Tunisia, they won a not so modest plurality, a significant plurality in the elections for the Constituent Assembly and the government. And in Egypt, too, they won what was ultimately a very slight majority. Now, in this moment, to turn back to Egypt, where the military knew that elections might lead to the election of the Brotherhood, why did they tolerate those elections? Why did the military tolerate those elections? I want to suggest to you straightforwardly that the reason they tolerated the elections is that they had no choice. The Brotherhood was so well organized, so broadly legitimate, that had the army refused to allow those elections, that is, refused to allow the Brotherhood to participate in those elections, and the two are much the same, there would have been a national feeling that what had happened in Tahrir Square in the first place was an aberration and a waste of time, and there would have been huge and significant frustration that would have extended beyond just the supporters of the Brotherhood, but would have extended to all of those people who were protesting the old regime. So in a very detailed, elaborate, multi-year negotiation, the Brotherhood and the army negotiated with each other, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, to share power. And this happened before the elections, during the elections, and then in the aftermath of the elections. And there were lots of inside baseball moments of who was up and who was down. In one crucial movement, the Brotherhood, once it had established that it won the legislative elections and the presidency, purged the senior generals, leaving behind a slightly younger generation of generals who they believed would be more pragmatic and willing to deal with them. Okay. Including Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who's the current highest-ranking military officer in Egypt. He's a lot younger than the guy he replaced, a whole generation younger. And it was the thought of the Brotherhood was, we know we can't trust the old guys. These guys we might be able to trust, and much more, they're willing to do a deal with us because, it's a good thing for them too. In a little inside baseball win for the military, the Constitutional Court of Egypt, which, at least according to reports in the New York Times, which if they are to be believed, represented interviews with members of the court, was working directly for the military. That's what the members of the Constitutional Court told the New York Times. They said, this is amazing. This rarely happens. It wasn't even anonymous. It was an open interview. They said, no, we've been coordinating with the military since the beginning. They call themselves a constitutional court. And they were considered one of the best constitutional courts in the Arab world, I'll tell you. I've been to, a dozen conferences with, I'm actually friends with some of the members of this court, God help me, because they're the ones who were there at the conferences. So they invalidated the elections for the legislature. The court held that those elections were invalid, and they dissolved the legislature. Dissolved as in poof, it no longer exists as a matter of law. Now, in the year that then followed, President Morsi, who was elected by the public to represent the Brotherhood and the public, governed, I think everyone who cares will tell you, very poorly. The only real question is whether he could have governed other than poorly given the constraints on him. And that, I think, is a genuine question. My own view is, for example, that the claim that he was governing autocratically rather than democratically is basically true, but it neglects to mention that the reason he was doing that is that the legislature had been dissolved. The legislature where he had a majority, his party had a majority, was dissolved by the Constitutional Court. So you tell me, how, if I'm the president, can I govern other than autocratically if my legislature doesn't exist? I mean, it's not a small matter. Now, are there things he could have done better subject to those constraints? Yes. Which ones are they? All of them. Okay? If you look at Tunisia, you can see what a slightly more rational Islamist party did in power. Refused to have any job in the country for which they were only themselves responsible. Compromised in constitutional drafting, for example, by agreeing to take Sharia, Islamic law, out of the Constitution when there were large protests calling for its ouster. Okay? Negotiated, compromised, to the point where their own supporters became furious with them and said, "We won. What is this?" And the leadership said, "I hate to break it to you, this is what's called democracy. We won, but that doesn't mean we won. Now we need to do deals." The Tunisian leadership tried to talk to the Egyptian leadership, tried to tell them to do these things. There were personal ties. And for the most part, the Egyptians wouldn't listen. And their argument, really, the Brotherhood's argument, was twofold. One, they said, "You don't understand. The army, the secularists, the deep state are trying to bring us down." Two, we won. Both of these statements were true, and both were irrelevant. They should have, nevertheless, tried to create at least the public perception of cooperation in order to avoid what was coming, what subsequently happened. Now, here comes the surprising part. Until now, I think almost everything that happened could have been predicted. And I don't want to literally say that I predicted it, but I had been arguing for roughly a decade that if you had free elections in Arabic-speaking countries, that Islamic democratic political parties would win pluralities or majorities, that they would take office with an intention of putting into place democratic systems of government that were nevertheless Islamically inflected, and that they would have a chance to govern, and that they would do neither better nor worse than anyone else in the world when they get a chance to govern. That the job of governance is a very hard job, but it wasn't especially inflected by ideology. And all that indeed had happened to this point. But here's the thing which I certainly didn't anticipate, and I don't know anyone else who specifically did. In Egypt, roughly the same demographic of people who had gone into Tahrir Square to protest the undemocratic regime of Mubarak, who had weakened him to the point where the army took him out, leading to elections, roughly that same group of people, coordinating in advance with social media, organized a movement to go back to the square with the goal of bringing down President Morsi. Now, from their perspective, which is what I'm going to turn to in about a moment, perhaps this looked like a replay of what had happened. They knew certain things. They knew that they could put 1 million people in the square, maybe more. They knew that if they put 1 million people or more in the square, it would weaken the existing regime. And they knew that if the existing regime were weakened, the military would call the head of the regime and say, "Sorry, you're out." What did they think was going to happen next? Well, that's what I'm going to turn to in just a moment. But presumably, to be charitable, because let's start by being charitable. I promise I won't end by being charitable. But to start by being charitable, presumably what they believed was that then there would be elections. It was what we used to call, when I was a kid playing hockey in the street, a do-over. You know, the car would come in the middle of you taking your shot, and everyone would have to freeze, and you'd run off the street. This was floor hockey, street hockey. And then you just do it over. That's presumably what they thought was going to happen. Presumably. That is, of course, not what happened exactly. The first part happened. They went to the streets. They called for the end of the regime. The army came out. It told the president he was no longer the president. It arrested everybody from the senior part of the regime, just like they had done with Mubarak, exactly the same story again. And then, no election. Instead, what happened? Instead, the government began to arrest not just the senior leadership of the Brotherhood, not just lower down Brotherhood members who had the temerity to remain in the square, because now they went into separate square and began to protest, not just hundreds of people whom it killed, because it did kill hundreds of people in putting down these protests, but, you guessed it, the pro-democracy activists who had called for the ouster of the Brotherhood in the first place. Right? So those people are now being arrested and swept up. Relatively secular, relatively elite, relatively liberal people who just facilitated the rise of the military are now being arrested by the military. Presumably, they didn't see that one coming. Okay, so perfect. I'm about 3/5 of the way through my time. And now I'm going to turn to my second question, which is, why didn't they see it coming? Put another way, how can we explain how the same people, again, roughly speaking, who bravely risked their lives to bring down a dictator, and who I would have said were Democrats, pro-democracy, pro-free speech, pro-elections, how could that same group of people, just a little more than a year later, have again risked their lives, although arguably they didn't think they would be killed the second time, but taking the significant risks, this time to bring down the democratically elected leader of the government that had come into power after they called for democracy? What were they thinking? Why did they take this action? And most to the point, why didn't they think that the army would this time not call for elections, but would take them out? So let's start with the nicest possible explanation, which I would call the naivete theory. The naivete theory says, come on, you're asking a lot of people for them to be cold-hearted, brutal political analysts. People who went into Tahrir Square did it because they were idealists, because they believed in seeing the possibilities of their country. Instead of thinking depressively about how bad things were, they said, we can change things. And then they did change things. And in that process, they came to trust the army, which they saw as actually standing up for the interests of the Egyptian people. Why? Because the army allowed free elections. And so, runs the naivete theory, they thought when we play the down over, when we do the same thing exactly the second time, the army will do what they did the first time. They'll hold open democratic elections. So all we're doing when we go into the square is saying, we want a do-over. We think this government's doing badly. We want him out. Let's just run the game over. Let's have a fresh election. So that's the naivete theory. Now, why was that view naive? I mean, the way I've just described it, maybe it actually seems credible. I mean, after all, it had just happened. You don't really get to run experiments very often in political life. But this time they had just run the experiment previously. They knew what happened. The army would take out the leadership, and then they would hold elections. So they expected the same results the next time they ran the experiment. What was naive about that? Well, what was naive about it is it failed to realize that the army had held elections only because of the existence of the Brotherhood. The army knew that there was one institution in the country that could counterbalance it, and that was the Brotherhood. So when they held the elections the first time, it was because they had no choice. They had to negotiate with the Brotherhood. But what happened by going into Tahrir Square the second time is that those self-same people, the Brotherhood, were now delegitimated because the protest was against them. So the army got the message, we can get rid of the Brotherhood, because there was a president. They did it, and once they did, no one was left to counterbalance the army. Right? There was no one left on the other side. And when there's no one left to counterbalance you, if there's one rule of international political life in every country on earth, it's if there's no one to balance you, you'll sustain complete and total power. I mean, you usually tell yourself, I have no choice. I must, for the good of my people. Right? I mean, you can do it in the best of possible motives, or you can certainly tell yourself you have the best of all possible motives. So on this theory, you have to believe that young, mostly liberal, largely secular, fairly well-educated activists were just hopelessly politically naive. And I want to just say that might be the correct theory. Okay, that might be true. It's not inconsistent with the facts. I'm a little skeptical of it because it's not as though anyone in this picture didn't understand that the army remained the dominant, powerful institution in the country. And it's not as though people trusted the army before Tahrir Square. Mubarak, after all, came out of the army. as did Sadat before him, as did Nasser before him. So Egypt isn't the place where you'd naturally think there was a lot of naivete about the army. Okay, so that's why I'm not crazy about that theory. So let me offer you theory 2. And let's call this theory liberal, not democratic. This theory goes back to a very basic historical truth about democracy, which we've forgotten in our contemporary world. And that historical truth about democracy is that democracy is not inherently liberal. That is to say, democracy isn't inherently committed to rights. Democracy is perfectly compatible with not respecting people's rights. Because the fundamental principle of democracy in historical terms is, what? If you had to say democracy in one sentence, explain it to your 6-year-old, majority rules. Right? I mean, later on we add subject to the requirement that every person be protected equally. But that's not technically the historical content of democracy. That's liberalism, the protection of individual liberties, that we've added to democracy because without it, democracy is not that great. Okay? On this view, what the people who went to Tahrir the first time and the second time believed in was not democracy, but liberalism. What they wanted was the protection of their individual liberties, their right to free speech, the right of every person to be treated equally. And on this view, those protesters feared that the Muslim Brotherhood in power would not give them those things. Okay? On this view, they feared that an Islamist democratic government couldn't be trusted on the democratic part of that. The first time they protested, they were angry because they didn't have liberal rights. And they kind of thought democracy would go along with that. But then when there was an election and a majority of the public preferred Islamic democracy, these liberals said, wait a minute. We really care about the liberalism part, not the democracy part. So we know we're acting undemocratically to bring down this government, because we know we're asking the army to overthrow the duly elected president, but it's worth it to protect individual rights and liberties, which we worry that the Brotherhood will not provide. Perhaps they won't guarantee women's equality, not that women's equality was treated well at any point in Egyptian history. Perhaps it won't guarantee freedom of speech, right? Perhaps it will undertake the Islamization of society, not something that a liberal person wants. Now, this second view, however, still requires you to imagine a certain error made by these folks, but it's not precisely, it's a little bit naive, but it's not as naive. It's an error of political analysis, and it runs like this. Why do governments respect liberal rights? What's in it for governments to respect liberal rights? Well, the first thing about it is that it buys you support and legitimacy from middle-class people who can afford to exercise those rights. If you're living in dire poverty, I'm sure you would like to speak freely, but first you'd like to eat. Okay? So it's an order of priorities. It's not that the poorest people don't want liberal rights. The poorest people do want liberal rights. It's just on their order of priorities, they don't come up as quickly. Okay? So regimes extend liberal rights, typically, to gain the adherence of the middle class. But what's the constraint on doing that if you're the government? You have to be prepared to give liberal rights to everybody and not have those people take out your government. The minute you think that extending those liberal rights will lead to the fall of your government, if you're smart, you won't extend the liberal rights. I mean, the great example of this, the negative example of this, is the Weimar Republic, which was the democratic liberal government of Germany between the two world wars. It was liberal, it was democratic, and it altogether declined to suppress growing Nazism because it was giving liberal rights to everybody. Free speech for everybody, including the people who say free speech is a terrible idea and they want to do something about it. If you do that, your government falls. So every person who exercises power since then knows that you're crazy to extend liberal rights across the board if there's some people who want to bring you down. So according to this second view, this liberal, not democratic view, The liberals' error was in thinking that the military would respect their liberal rights because, after all, they were part of the middle class that cares about rights. The military would probably be happy to respect those people's rights if they would support the military all the time. But it was never going to be realistic for the military to be able to do that, because if they allowed free speech, that would mean free speech by the Brotherhood. If they allowed freedom of assembly, that would mean freedom of assembly by the Brotherhood. If they allowed freedom of religion, that would be certainly freedom of religion by the Brotherhood. So the military could never afford to extend these rights. The minute the Brotherhood was out, it had to suppress all of these rights, and to do so for the foreseeable future. So here, I don't know if it's naivete, but it's an error on the part of these liberals. On this view, they were not completely naive. They knew the military would take out the Brotherhood, and then they knew that the military would suppress the rights of the Brotherhood. But they mistakenly thought that they could keep their rights while the Brotherhood lost its rights. Call it a mistake of solidarity. They didn't have any solidarity with the Brotherhood, which they didn't especially care for. So they thought they could keep their rights while the Brotherhood didn't keep its rights, and they were just wrong. It's not quite naive. It's a calculation mistake, calculation error. So that's the second theory, and it also could be true. I'm going to ask you guys, not to by show of hands, but in our conversation, to tell me which one you think of these is right. And I have a third one that I'm going to come to before I shut up. I think the drawback of this theory is, where on earth today is there a society that respects liberal rights in the absence of democracy? I mean, you could have such a thing, and historically there were such things. You know? I mean, the Prussian state in the years of its rise. If you were an ordinary middle-class person, you could have a fair amount of freedom of speech. The newspapers printed a pretty broad variety of public opinion. I mean, I don't want to overstate the case. This is Dr. McClatchy's area of specialty, so I don't want to speak too precisely, but that's also why the example came into my mind. You could have a situation where you don't have really free elections, you don't have the full array of democracy, but you have the respective liberal rights for the middle class. It's conceivable in historical terms. There's no place like that on earth today, however. No place like that. Even Singapore, which maybe comes the closest, has a pretty narrowly constricted range of public opinion. You know, there are a lot of things that you can say. They're all the unimportant ones. Nothing really important can be said publicly in Singapore politically, and certainly can't be written in the newspapers. So given that there's no place in the world today where you could look and say, aha, good liberal rights, no democracy, I'm a little suspicious of this second interpretation also. Okay, last suggestion, and this is the most cynical and perhaps the most depressing, but it's also one that needs to be taken seriously. And it runs something like this. According to this third view, the people who went in Tahrir the second time knew that they would lose liberal rights. And they knew that democracy in Egypt would be suppressed for the foreseeable future, but it was okay with them. Why was it okay with them? Because the threat of an Islamic democratic government coming to power and staying in power, either by popular election or by abolishing elections, was so great in their minds that they were willing to pay the price of the loss of their democratic aspirations in order to avoid that happening. Now you may say, why would anybody do that? Why would anybody think that? But of course the answer is that for many years, many generations, the standard form of political discourse in Egypt and in many other Arabic-speaking countries from secular dictators was, you may not like me, but if you don't have me, you're going to have the Islamists, and that will be worse. Take me rather than the Islamists. Sure enough, Mubarak fell, there were elections, and what do you know? Here come the Islamists. So people might have said to themselves, uh-oh, that part of the prediction was true. What about the last part of the prediction, which was the Islamists will be worse than the secular dictators? Now that hadn't happened yet. And if you look at Tunisia, There's no evidence whatsoever that it was going to happen. That doesn't mean that people weren't worried about it, however. People might be worried about limitations on their free speech along religious lines. They might be worried about institutionalized sexism. I'm not attributing these things to the Islamist movement. I'm describing to you what the critics of the Islamist movement have always said. Okay? And what they could continue to say, and did continue to say, while Morsi was, in his incompetent sort of way, wandering through the presidency, lurching from one disaster to another. So on this view, the cynical view, it was literally a do-over, as in, whoops, we're sorry. We'll take back a new Mubarak, maybe a kinder, gentler one this time, although so far no evidence of that. But we made a mistake. We opened the doors to Islamic democracy. We want those doors shut. Notice it doesn't have to be a majority of the Egyptian people who feel that way. In fact, we know it isn't because there were 3 elections during the Brotherhood's time in power, one for the presidency, one for the Legislative Assembly, and one for ratification of the Constitution. The Brotherhood won all of them by roughly the same margin of just past 50%. But so let's say it's 48%. Let's say it's 20%. Let's say it's 10% of the Egyptian public. It doesn't really matter what the numbers are. If that part of the public was willing to go to the square and run the clock back and do the whole thing over again, they could get the army to come in and get rid of the Brotherhood. And this time it would be getting rid of the Brotherhood once and for all. Okay? Now on this view, the people in Tahrir the last time were not naive. They didn't miscalculate. They just would prefer autocracy to democracy carrying the risk of an Islamic democratic state, which might turn out not to be Islamic democratic. Right? We don't know yet. So that seems to me, sadly, the more I think about this, to be probably the best plausible interpretation. It's not the most charitable, but the most plausible interpretation of the political events of recent months. Now, if it is true, what it means is significant for our theory of democracy, and I'm going to close here. You know, democracy depends on the idea that most people want democracy. Right? It depends on that idea. If you think that most people don't want democracy, there's really nothing so great about democracy. Right? If nothing else, democracy has to depend on the idea that it's popularly legitimate. If the public doesn't want to be governed democratically, why should they be? Now, it's tricky here because we don't exactly know what the numbers were. In the election, people did vote for democratic institutions. But if significant numbers of people are willing to go to the streets and risk their lives again to say they don't want democracy, then the polity in which they live is not going to get democracy. It's going to get something else. And for now, what's going to get in Egypt is a touch of the old ways. We're going to get back something very, very, very similar to the situation under Mubarak, with the suppression of the Brotherhood, which was historically suppressed, and a prayer, a hope, on the part of Egyptians that the continuing conflict between the Brotherhood and the state will not lead to the situation that exists in Syria, where the rebellion against the regime has issued in a permanent civil war. Now, I don't think that will happen in Egypt. It doesn't have the same ethno-denominational feature that it does in Syria. But the fact that it may not, and that most Egyptians think it won't, might be a reason again for them to embrace the elimination of the democratic institutions that they briefly created. And that, if it's true, will call for a fundamental rethinking by those of us who care about democracy in the Arabic-speaking world of what the prospects for democratization are. I believe for a long time that Tunisia was what we now have in Tunisia, a halting, slow, cautious process towards something like a constitutional democracy with Islamic values, was the way that we would probably see things playing out in the Arabic-speaking world. And I thought, with all of its many flaws, this picture was better than the alternatives. I now obviously cannot think that that's where we're headed. And the time has come to ask whether a society that's as deeply divided as Egypt apparently is between people who are willing to support a government like that and people who weren't willing to support a government like that is capable of democratic self-government. It's nothing to do with the religion. It's nothing even to do with the culture. It's to do with the depth of the disagreement that exists within the society on the core question of how they ought to be governed. Because if even a substantial minority of people believe that democracy will lead to a government that they cannot tolerate, those people can block democracy forever. The good news is they're not that unhappy about it. Those people are not that unhappy about it. The people left holding the bag who are unhappy about it will be the people who bet on democracy. The people who said, democracy, that's the way of the world. That will be good. And what I predict will happen is that over the next 25 years, Islamic democracy as an ideology which built up over the last 25 years will gradually deteriorate. Because if you're one of the Islamists and you've come to embrace the values of democracy, in part because you know that the people want you and that you'll win elections, nothing wrong with that. That's why everyone likes democracy, because they think they'll win elections. If you know that you've won the elections, but you can't be allowed to govern, you'll look for some other technology of governance. And next time, it won't be democratic. Which of these is the right answer, then, has consequences? This is not an abstract question. If you believe in the naivete theory, there is still hope for democratization, even in Egypt. If you believe in the miscalculation theory, then it's a little harder to picture it, but you could picture negotiations in the real world that led to a recalculation and perhaps the emergence of, again, some kind of compromise regime. If you believe the third theory, the game is over, if the game was democracy in Egypt. And all you can do is hope that things don't end up in the direction of Syria and aspire for the Tunisians to manage their small country in a relatively competent way. And then perhaps a generation or 2 generations later, people will come to think that Islamic democratic regimes are not the end of the world. So I don't want to leave you with a purely depressing conclusion, because theory 1 or 2 could be true. And I want to be convinced that theory 1 or 2 is true. But at the moment, as we try to interpret ongoing historical events, my first responsibility is to be honest with you. And what I'm telling you is that the evidence to me seems to support theory 3. So thank you for listening so patiently. And we've got, I think, a half an hour, so we should be able to have a good conversation. I'm eager to hear your questions.